The forest had a way of swallowing the sun, its tangled limbs blotting out entire afternoons, and within its shadowed depths lay a settlement the world had forgotten. For decades, families had lived here without intrusion, their lives folded inward like secret letters never sent. Among them, a young woman moved with an uncanny stillness, her features both familiar and wrong, as though the blood of generations had twisted in ways no outsider could understand. She carried life inside her, though the world beyond the trees had long since shifted into chaos. The war had ended, though no one here had known. The news arrived like a whisper, stirring unease more than joy. She walked past shuttered homes and murmuring neighbors, the pregnancy visible beneath her threadbare dress, each step a reminder of the impossible continuity of hidden sins. The woods around her seemed to bend closer, holding their breath, as if the trees themselves were aware of the secrets pressing against the surface. And when the stranger finally stumbled into their hidden enclave, curiosity and fear collided, setting a quiet tension that hummed like electricity through the air. Eyes followed her everywhere, hearts pounded, and the past, the twisted lineage of those who had come before, pressed down like a weight that could never be lifted. Something waited at the edge of the settlement, something small and new, yet capable of exposing everything the woods had tried to keep hidden. The settlement was not marked on any map, nor did it appear in the sparse accounts of travelers or the few surveyors who had wandered the edges of the forest decades ago. It existed as if the trees themselves had conspired to hide it, a cluster of weathered cabins and shanties nestled in hollows and clearings where sunlight struggled to reach the moss-covered ground. The homes were constructed from timber felled from the surrounding forest, their beams darkened with age and smoke, roofs sagging under years of neglect yet somehow holding together, as though the forest had cradled them into permanence. A thin, winding trail led from one dwelling to another, etched into the undergrowth and known only to those who had been born and raised there. The air was dense with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and smoke from small, steady fires that never seemed to go out, their occupants wary of strangers who might stumble upon the enclave. Life in the settlement moved with a rhythm entirely its own, untethered from the world beyond the trees. Seasons passed almost unnoticed, measured not by the calendar or by clocks but by the bloom of wildflowers, the migration of birds, and the subtle changes in the forest that signaled the coming of winter or the thaw of spring. Children learned to navigate the woods before they could walk steadily, their laughter mingling with the rustling leaves, their games often taking them deep into places even adults approached with caution. The residents hunted and foraged, their diet consisting largely of what the forest provided: wild berries, mushrooms, fish from the slow-moving creek, and small game trapped in hidden snares. There were no modern conveniences here, no electricity, no running water, no contact with the outside world. Books and written records were few, kept more as talismans or memory aids than as tools for education. Every household bore the marks of generations, the walls lined with handmade furniture, crude carvings, and relics passed down with reverence and secrecy. The people themselves had adapted to isolation in ways that made them appear peculiar to outsiders. Eyes were sharp, wary, often unnervingly observant, and features carried the subtle echoes of decades of intermarriage within the same families, though this was never openly discussed. Relationships and alliances were formed not just by blood or preference but by a complex web of loyalty, survival, and unspoken rules that outsiders could never hope to untangle. Social rituals were tightly controlled, with courtship, marriages, and births observed under strict customs designed to maintain the balance of the community. Each individual's role was carefully defined, from the elders who kept the history of the place alive through stories whispered at night, to the children who learned the forest's secrets before they could read, to the young women and men whose lives were quietly shaped by expectation, necessity, and the weight of inherited knowledge. The settlement existed as a world unto itself, a fragile ecosystem of people and trees, silence and shadow, growing ever more insular with each passing generation, protected by the thick tangle of limbs and leaves that concealed it from discovery. The young woman stood apart in ways that no one could entirely ignore, though the reasons were woven into the very fabric of her being and the bloodline she carried. Her features were both familiar and unnervingly altered, a living testament to generations of closely intertwined families whose secrets had long been protected from the outside world. There was a subtle irregularity in the shape of her eyes, a peculiar sharpness to her cheekbones, and a thinness to her lips that seemed to echo faces from the past yet did not resemble any one person entirely. The elders spoke little of her, for she was both precious and unsettling, the product of a pattern that had repeated for decades in whispered cycles of marriages and alliances intended to keep the families contained and hidden. She moved with a cautious grace, aware of the way people watched her, yet her expression often betrayed a distant, almost imperceptible sorrow, as if she understood the weight she carried in silence. From the earliest age, she had been marked as different. Children in the settlement, though raised with her, would sometimes flinch at her presence or whisper behind her back, caught between recognition and fear. Adults approached her with a mixture of reverence and unease, uncertain whether her uniqueness was a blessing or a portent of deeper complications. Her body, lean and fragile, seemed to hold secrets in every line and movement, while her eyes suggested an awareness beyond her years, a knowledge of patterns and histories that most could barely recall. Even the forest seemed to respond to her, the wind brushing past her as though carrying warnings, shadows falling in ways that made her passage through the trees both silent and commanding. She had learned to navigate the subtle judgments of her own people, understanding the delicate balance between being noticed and being avoided. Tasks were often delegated to her with caution, conversations approached with care, and yet no one could deny her presence had a strange authority, the kind that does not demand obedience but elicits attention through the mere fact of being. She was aware of the stories whispered in corners, of the glances exchanged when she passed, and of the rumors that sometimes rose like smoke in the hearthlit evenings. The elders, in particular, treated her with an odd combination of pride and fear, for she represented both the continuation of their lineage and the possible unraveling of the fragile equilibrium that isolation had maintained. Her existence embodied the community's paradox, a mix of devotion to bloodlines and the haunting consequences of generations of insularity. She was the living record of what had been, and a sign of what could come, a reminder that even the most carefully guarded secrets carried their own momentum. Every movement, every glance, every whispered word in her presence reinforced the sense that she was both central and alien, a figure whose life and body had become entwined with the community's hidden history in ways that were impossible to ignore or fully understand. The revelation of her pregnancy unsettled the settlement in ways that had been building silently for years, a quiet tension that now surged to the surface with the weight of inevitability. It was not simply the condition itself, but the circumstances surrounding it that ignited fear and curiosity alike. In a community so tightly controlled, where each union was scrutinized and every birth accounted for, the knowledge that a young woman so singular in her traits carried life was both extraordinary and alarming. The pregnancy made tangible the hidden lineage she embodied, a living reminder of patterns repeated through generations, and it carried with it the unspoken questions that no one dared voice aloud. She herself moved with a careful vigilance, aware that every step, every shift of her body, drew attention. The pregnancy had changed her subtly at first, her movements becoming slower, her hands brushing instinctively over her abdomen, her eyes carrying a depth of awareness that seemed to expand with each passing week. Those who had once watched her with distant curiosity now studied her more closely, noting the curve of her form, the way she rested or labored through the day's chores, the quiet strength she displayed despite exhaustion. There was an unease in the glances of the elders, a flicker of concern and calculation, as though they were weighing the implications of what this birth could mean not only for the child, but for the delicate balance of their isolated world. The forest, too, seemed to acknowledge the change, its rustling leaves carrying a heightened tension as she walked its hidden trails. The air itself felt heavier around her, saturated with the scent of earth and smoke, as if the natural world had taken note of the life she carried. Other women in the settlement, those who had once regarded her with cautious respect or silent envy, now approached her with a mixture of curiosity and subtle wariness, offering assistance in hushed tones, their hands lingering briefly on her shoulders or arms, unsure whether to comfort or guard against some unseen consequence. Even the children seemed to sense the shift, their games quieting when she passed, their laughter tapering off into whispers. They could not understand fully what her pregnancy meant, but the change in her presence was undeniable. In the evenings, when shadows stretched long across the cabins and the smoke from the hearths wavered in the still air, she would sit apart, hands pressed to her swelling belly, listening to the whispers and glances of the others, aware that she had become the axis upon which hidden tensions now turned. Her life and the life growing within her were inexorably tied to the community's future, a living embodiment of its history, its secrecy, and the fragile boundaries that separated order from chaos. Every heartbeat, every quiet movement, every breath was observed, weighed, and interpreted, as though the forest itself held judgment over the unfolding reality she carried. The end of the war reached the settlement like a distant echo, carried through the whispers of a few travelers who had skirted the edges of the forest, their news arriving in fragments, cautious and halting. For generations, the people here had existed in deliberate isolation, their lives tethered only to the rhythm of the woods and the cycles of their own families, yet the announcement of peace outside stirred something unrecognizable within them. The young woman, already marked by her uniqueness and her pregnancy, felt the weight of this news more acutely than anyone else. It was as though the world beyond the trees, which she had never truly known, had suddenly pressed itself against the fragile walls of their hidden world, reminding everyone of realities they had chosen to ignore. The elders convened in hushed gatherings, speaking in low tones behind closed doors, their conversations filled with fear and calculation. What did the war's end mean for them? Would outsiders begin to seek the forest's secrets, to expose the community's careful concealment? Their anxiety was mirrored in the pregnant woman's own unease, though hers was compounded by the intimate knowledge that the life she carried might become a symbol of vulnerability, a link between their secluded existence and the encroaching world. The once silent woods seemed different somehow, as if the announcement of distant battles concluded had stirred echoes in the branches, a tension that threaded through the leaves and into the soil beneath their feet. The young woman found herself thinking more about the edges of the forest than ever before, about the possibility of discovery and intrusion, of judgment from a society whose rules she had never truly understood. Though she had lived her entire life within this microcosm, the end of the war carried a sense of inevitability, a reminder that isolation could not last forever. Even within the settlement, her presence as a pregnant woman became charged with new significance. She was no longer merely an embodiment of the community's secretive past, she was a potential bridge to the unknown, a harbinger of change that no one could yet define or control. The children and younger members of the community sensed the shift subtly, their routines disrupted by the elders' quiet agitation and the pregnant woman's more frequent absences or moments of reflection. Work in the fields and along the creeks continued, but an unspoken tension lingered over the daily tasks, a recognition that the world beyond their hidden enclave had moved forward while they had remained stationary. Even in moments of quiet, the forest seemed to hold its breath, the wind carrying a faint vibration of change, a warning that the end of the war outside might bring far more than relief, it might bring revelation, intrusion, or upheaval. And as she rested beneath the skeletal canopy, feeling the slow movements of the life within her, the young woman could not shake the sense that history, both personal and collective, had suddenly caught up with their secluded existence in a way that demanded acknowledgement. The stranger arrived on a grey morning, when mist hung low over the forest floor and the settlement seemed poised between dream and reality. No one saw him enter, he appeared at the edge of the clearing as if materialized from the fog itself, a man whose presence was at once ordinary and deeply unsettling. He carried little with him, only a worn satchel and a careful gait that suggested both caution and purpose. The elders were the first to notice him, their sharp eyes catching the movement through gaps in the trees, and immediately a ripple of alarm passed through the community. Visitors were rare, almost unheard of, and the sudden appearance of an outsider shattered the carefully maintained rhythm of their secluded lives. Whispers spread quickly, a quiet undercurrent that threaded through cabins and along hidden paths. Children peered through foliage, curiosity battling the instinctive caution taught from birth, while adults lingered in doorways and near hearths, watching him with a mixture of suspicion and unease. The young woman, already pregnant and burdened with the weight of her own secret, felt a pulse of anxiety when she first caught sight of him. There was something in the way he moved, a deliberate observation, a probing gaze that seemed to measure the forest itself and the lives of those who lived within it. He did not speak immediately, and his silence carried the weight of intention, suggesting he had come not merely to pass through, but to see and understand what the woods had hidden for so long. The elders convened in tense council, their voices low, words measured. The stranger could not be dismissed casually, his presence demanded strategy, vigilance, and discretion. Some argued for confrontation, others for observation, each suggestion revealing fissures in their once unified front. Meanwhile, the pregnant woman found herself drawn to him despite fear, sensing that his arrival might alter the delicate equilibrium that had defined her entire existence. The forest, too, seemed aware of the intrusion, branches swaying unnaturally and shadows stretching longer as if warning of the disruption. 4 days, the stranger moved along the outskirts, sometimes glimpsed through the trees, sometimes gone entirely, leaving only disturbed undergrowth as evidence of his passage. His presence unsettled routines, altered interactions, and forced the residents to reconsider their assumptions about safety and isolation. Even the quietest corners of the settlement seemed to vibrate with anticipation, each individual attuned to the subtle shifts in behavior, the pauses in conversation, the cautious glances exchanged when he was near. In this fragile world, where every movement and word was weighted with meaning, the stranger became a focal point of tension, curiosity, and fear, an external force pressing against the tightly bound community. The pregnant woman, acutely aware of her own vulnerability and the life she carried, could not ignore the way his presence stirred unease in the air, a foreboding sense that the hidden patterns of the past were on the verge of being exposed, and that the forest, with all its secrets, might finally be forced to yield to a world beyond its shadowed boundaries. The whispers of the past began to slither through the settlement like smoke, curling into every cabin, every hidden alcove, until even the youngest children seemed to sense their presence. Stories long buried resurfaced in fragments, half-remembered tales passed down by elders who had once spoken of ancestors in hushed tones, their words laden with fear and reverence. These accounts described unions that had been carefully orchestrated over generations, marriages meant to preserve bloodlines, and the consequences that followed when the boundaries of tradition were ignored or bent. With the stranger's arrival and the awareness of the young woman's pregnancy, the past could no longer remain silent. It pressed forward, demanding recognition, threatening to reveal the patterns the community had meticulously concealed. Every interaction became heavy with implication, every glance and gesture interpreted as a reflection of histories too complex to untangle. Neighbors and relatives whispered behind closed doors, recounting events that had shaped the settlement in ways no outsider could understand, stories of births and deaths, of unions that had strengthened and sometimes fractured the community, of hidden illnesses and traits that surfaced unpredictably. The pregnant woman became a living symbol of these legacies, a reminder that the sins, choices, and secrets of generations were not erased by time but carried forward in flesh and blood. She moved through the settlement with a careful awareness of the murmurs that followed her, of the weight of expectation and fear that had suddenly intensified around her. The elders, who had long maintained control over the flow of knowledge, felt their authority challenged as stories emerged that could no longer be contained. They debated, argued, and sometimes fell silent, realizing that the past had a stubborn persistence, capable of undermining the structure they had built to keep the community insulated. Even the most steadfast residents began to question the narratives they had inherited, wondering which details were truth, which were exaggeration, and which had been deliberately obscured. The pregnant woman sensed the tension, noticing the way people's eyes lingered, how conversations abruptly stopped when she entered a room, how small children paused mid-step, as if absorbing a threat they could not name. The forest itself seemed to resonate with these echoes, the rustle of leaves and the creak of branches forming a backdrop to the human unease. Nights became restless, filled with whispered confessions and tentative revelations. Stories that had once been safely tucked away in memory were now resurfacing in fragments, accounts of forbidden desires, hidden alliances, illnesses that appeared mysteriously in certain families, and unexplained deaths that had never been fully discussed. Each revelation carried weight, a reminder that isolation had not erased the consequences of human choice, that the cycles of the past were inseparable from the present. The pregnant woman, at the center of this emerging web of memory, could feel the pressure mounting, an invisible force reminding her and everyone in the settlement that the history they had tried to bury was far from finished and that the consequences of long-kept secrets were beginning to ripple outward in ways they could not control. The forest surrounding the settlement was no passive backdrop. It existed as an omnipresent witness, a silent guardian of secrets that had festered for generations. Its gnarled trees and thick undergrowth seemed to breathe along with the people who lived beneath their shadow, their limbs intertwining in ways that created corridors of darkness, pockets where sound died, and where prying eyes were rendered useless. Every path through the woods had been mapped in memory alone, each twist and hollow understood only by those born and raised within its confines. The forest observed without judgment, yet its presence was palpable, as though it had absorbed the echoes of countless whispered confessions, the hidden rituals of marriages and births, and the murmur of fears too dangerous to speak aloud. For the young woman, the forest's watchfulness was a constant companion. She could feel its gaze in the sway of branches overhead, in the way the underbrush seemed to shift subtly beneath her feet, in the quiet rustling that often came at the edge of her awareness. It was as if the trees themselves recognized the significance of her pregnancy, the anomaly she represented in a lineage that had long been tightly controlled. At times, she imagined the forest curving protectively around her, a living shield against intrusion, yet she also sensed a warning woven into the wind, a whisper that the hidden truths she carried were delicate and dangerous. To venture too far, or to reveal too much, might awaken forces both human and elemental, forces the settlement had survived only through careful respect and fear of what lay beyond conscious understanding. Even the community's children, who ran freely through the undergrowth, knew to listen to the forest. They sensed the subtle warnings in the rustle of leaves, the tilt of a branch, or the way shadows fell unevenly across the ground. Lessons of caution had been ingrained from birth. Never stray beyond the known, never challenge the forest's quiet dominion, never betray its secrets. The adults, too, moved with a reverence born of years, understanding that the woods were more than trees and soil, they were memory, judgment, and protector all at once. Patterns of life within the settlement followed the rhythms of the forest, each task and ritual intertwined with the quiet, observant presence of the woods, and any disturbance, whether a new life, a stranger, or a whispered truth, was felt immediately by the living canopy above. The pregnant woman's movements became a delicate negotiation with the forest itself, each step measured, each pause attuned to the subtle signs around her. The trees seemed to react to her state, bending shadows in ways that suggested both warning and vigilance, their branches swaying as if in silent conversation. At night, the wind through the leaves carried an almost sentient resonance, a reminder that the woods were not passive, that nothing that occurred within the settlement escaped their attention. The forest's watch was unbroken, impartial yet inexorable, and it seemed to hold the future of the young woman, her unborn child, and the settlement itself in its patient, ancient gaze, as though all that had happened and all that was yet to come were threads woven into its endless, shadowed canopy. Tensions within the settlement began to surface in ways that had long been suppressed, subtle cracks widening into open friction as the implications of the young woman's pregnancy became impossible to ignore. Families who had coexisted for generations under a fragile code of unspoken rules now found themselves at odds over how to respond to the change. The elders, who had long maintained authority through a combination of tradition and fear, sensed that their influence was being challenged by the uncertainty the pregnancy brought. Some argued for strict control, insisting that the woman's movements and interactions be monitored, that the child be born under their supervision to ensure the continuity of their lineage. Others advocated a softer approach, emphasizing protection, compassion, and the need to shield her from the heightened scrutiny that had begun to suffuse every corner of their secluded world. Every interaction between members of the community became a negotiation, fraught with tension, suspicion, and the constant awareness of past transgressions. Allies formed and dissolved quickly, sometimes in the span of a single conversation, as motives were questioned and loyalties tested. The pregnant woman herself became a focal point of these disputes, her presence both a unifying concern and a source of division. Tasks she once performed without comment were now observed, corrected, or debated, and even small gestures, passing food, tending the fire, carrying water, were imbued with the weight of significance, interpreted as signs of allegiance, defiance, or betrayal. The strain extended to the children, who, though largely innocent of the complexities around them, absorbed the tension like shadows settling into the corners of their minds. Playgrounds became arenas of whispered conversations and tentative alliances, their laughter hesitant and punctuated with sudden silences when an adult passed. Young adults and older siblings found themselves questioning the wisdom of tradition, balancing ingrained loyalty against instinctive empathy, uncertain whether obedience to the elders' dictates or the protection of the pregnant woman would ultimately define their role within the community. Even the forest seemed to reflect the escalating conflict, the wind rustling through branches in irregular rhythms, shadows stretching longer and darker across the paths as if amplifying the anxiety. Night brought no relief. Whispered arguments carried through the cabins, punctuated by sighs and footsteps that betrayed sleep lost to worry. Every corner of the settlement was charged with an awareness that the pregnancy had shifted the balance of power, revealing weaknesses, latent fears, and hidden resentments that had long been contained beneath the surface. The young woman, aware of the delicate and often contradictory forces surrounding her, moved with caution, understanding that each choice she made might provoke confrontation or intervention, that even silence could be interpreted as rebellion. Within this tense, watchful environment, the community's cohesion was tested in ways that mirrored the fragility of the lineage she carried, and every heartbeat and whispered word seemed to resonate with the unspoken understanding that the equilibrium of their hidden world had been disrupted, teetering on the edge of something far larger than any single individual. The revelation of the young woman's lineage unfolded slowly, like a hidden stream carving its way through the dense undergrowth, exposing patterns long obscured by secrecy and time. Hidden records, fragile journals, and the hushed recollections of elders painted a picture of generations intertwined far more intricately than anyone had previously understood. Marriages had been arranged with meticulous care, often between close relatives, to preserve the family line and maintain control over inheritance, resources, and knowledge within the secluded settlement. The consequences of these unions were evident not only in the young woman's features and health but also in the subtle peculiarities observed in those around her, hints of traits carried through decades of insular breeding. Each revelation sent ripples through the community, forcing individuals to confront the extent to which their lives had been shaped by these unbroken cycles. Elders, once proud of their careful maintenance of lineage and order, now spoke in tones tinged with anxiety and regret. They recounted instances of hidden deformities, early deaths, and unusual behaviors, all carefully concealed to maintain the illusion of normalcy. The knowledge that the young woman was a living embodiment of these patterns heightened the tension. She represented both the persistence of their carefully guarded history and the fragility inherent in repeating the same choices without consideration of consequence. The pregnant woman herself felt the weight of these revelations keenly. She became increasingly aware that her life was inseparable from the stories of those who had come before her, that her body and the child she carried were not only a continuation of a lineage but also a living record of its complications and secrets. Every glance from neighbors, every whispered comment, every cautious step she took through the settlement reminded her that she was under scrutiny not merely as an individual, but as a nexus of inherited traits, behaviors, and expectations. Even the children seemed to recognize the shift, observing her with a mixture of curiosity and unease, their awareness instinctively attuned to the significance of her presence. The forest, long a silent guardian, seemed to press closer as the details of the lineage emerged. Paths that had been familiar now felt charged, as if the trees themselves understood that the settlement's past was no longer hidden from the consciousness of its residents. Discussions among adults became longer and more strained, debates over responsibility, protection, and the potential consequences of the young woman's pregnancy dominating conversations that had once been mundane. With every uncovered fragment, the settlement's delicate equilibrium teetered further. People who had accepted their world without question now questioned the morality, wisdom, and inevitability of the systems that had governed them. The young woman, aware of the magnified scrutiny and the invisible weight of history pressing upon her, could feel the invisible web of lineage stretching taut around her, binding her, her unborn child, and the community itself in a complex pattern that had been set into motion long before she existed, yet whose consequences were becoming terrifyingly immediate and unavoidable. A sense of looming inevitability hung over the settlement, a quiet, almost suffocating tension that suggested the birth of the young woman's child would not be an ordinary event but a turning point that could unravel the delicate balance of their hidden world. Whispers of what might come had grown louder, threading through cabins, trails, and the forest itself, shaping behavior and fueling apprehension. The child, already anticipated as a symbol of both continuity and disruption, was imagined by some as a blessing and by others as a portent, a physical manifestation of all the secrets, choices, and genetic patterns that had accumulated over generations. No one spoke openly of fear, yet it was present in every glance, every careful gesture, every moment of silence. The pregnant woman felt the weight of this expectation with increasing intensity. Each day that passed added to a mounting sense of responsibility and dread, her movements becoming more measured, her thoughts more introspective. She sensed that the community's attention, already heightened by her condition, would reach a climax with the moment of birth, when the life she carried would be revealed not just as an individual being but as a reflection of the past. The forest, too, seemed to acknowledge the approaching event, the rustle of leaves and the whisper of wind carrying an almost sentient anticipation, a silent reminder that nothing occurring within the settlement escaped the watchful presence of the woods. Elders debated quietly but urgently, discussing preparations in ways that were both practical and symbolic, as though the arrival of the child required a ritual recognition of the lineage it represented. The community's younger members observed and absorbed these discussions, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing a pivotal moment in the life of their enclave. Subtle shifts in behavior became apparent, chores left incomplete, hushed conversations paused abruptly, glances exchanged with intensity, all underscoring a collective consciousness focused on the inevitable. Even the children, though largely unaware of the implications, sensed a heightened tension, their play subdued, their laughter measured, as though the air itself carried a warning they could not articulate. The pregnant woman moved with care, balancing the demands of her body with the invisible weight of expectation pressing down upon her. Every step was a negotiation with both the community and the forest, every interaction a delicate dance of compliance, observation, and restraint. The settlement held its collective breath, aware that the child's arrival would illuminate not only her personal circumstances but the hidden, interwoven histories of the families who had lived in isolation for generations. It was a moment pregnant with possibility and peril, a convergence of the past, present, and future that no one could fully predict or control, and an event that promised to bring revelation, challenge, and perhaps irreparable change to the secluded enclave and the generations it had protected so fiercely.